On the night of July 11th, 2015, inside one of the most secure prisons on Earth, a man took a shower. The Altiplano Federal Prison in central Mexico had been built with one purpose: to hold criminals who could never be allowed to escape. Every corridor was monitored, every movement recorded, every inmate watched around the clock. And this man was watched more closely than anyone else: Joaquín Archibaldo Guzmán Loera, El Chapo, the most powerful drug trafficker in the world. At 8:52 p.m., security cameras showed him pacing inside his cell. He stopped, walked toward the shower, and disappeared behind a waist-high concrete partition that blocked the camera's view. Guards had seen this routine countless times before. Nothing seemed out of place. Minutes passed. Then more minutes. When guards finally entered the cell, they found it empty. No broken doors, no alarms, no signs of a struggle. Just a square hole cut into the shower floor. Beneath it was a ladder. Beneath that, a tunnel stretching more than a mile, reinforced with lighting, ventilation, and a rail system. At the bottom waited a motorcycle. The most hunted man on the planet had vanished again. That moment raised a question far bigger than a prison escape, because this wasn't luck, it wasn't chaos, and it wasn't desperation. It was planning. And to understand how El Chapo pulled off the impossible not once but repeatedly, you have to understand something most people get wrong about him. El Chapo wasn't just a drug lord, he was a system. Long before tunnels, prisons, and billion-dollar manhunts, Joaquín Guzmán was born into a world that quietly trained him for exactly what he would become. He was born on April 4, 1957, in a tiny mountain hamlet called La Tuna, deep inside Mexico's Golden Triangle, where the borders of Sinaloa, Durango, and Chihuahua meet. The land was harsh and isolated, with little government presence. Authority didn't come from law, but whoever controlled the trade, and the trade was drugs. In La Tuna, marijuana and opium poppies weren't criminal enterprises, they were survival. Entire families depended on them. Children learned the value of crops before they learned arithmetic. Fields of poppies stretched across the mountains like silent factories. For Guzmán, this world wasn't shocking, it was normal. His father, Emilio Guzmán Bustillos, was a cattle farmer who also participated in the local drug economy. Accounts differ on his character, but what's clear is that Joaquín's real influence came from his mother, María Consuelo Loera Pérez. She was relentless and tireless, known throughout the region for her work ethic. Joaquín watched everything. From an early age, he wasn't just curious, he was transactional. Relatives recalled how he stacked fake paper bills and asked his mother to save them. He sold oranges to travelers along mountain roads and wore fake gold chains to impress family on Sundays, even as the cheap metals stained his skin green. He wasn't powerful yet, he wasn't feared, but he was already thinking in terms of value, image, and leverage. And in a place like the Golden Triangle, those traits mattered more than education. As a teenager, Joaquín worked directly in the drug fields, tending illegal crops, before moving to the nearby town of Badiraguato in search of opportunity. He found it at a time when the drug world was about to explode. Demand in the United States was skyrocketing, recreational drug use had become normalized, and when American authorities dismantled a major European smuggling route known as the French Connection, that demand didn't disappear, it shifted south. Mexico became the gateway. At the center of that gateway stood Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, known as El Padrino. He ran the Guadalajara Cartel, Mexico's first true corporate drug organization. It controlled routes, enforced discipline, and operated like a centralized monopoly. Joaquín Guzmán climbed its ranks quickly, not through bravado, but through reliability. He learned logistics, discipline, and patience, but the system that elevated him was about to collapse. In 1985, DEA agent Enrique Kiki Camarena was kidnapped, tortured, and murdered. The backlash triggered an all-out assault by American and Mexican authorities. Over the next 4 years, the Guadalajara Cartel was dismantled, leaders were arrested, roots fractured, and power vacuumed out of the system. In that vacuum, Joaquín made the most important decision of his life. He didn't fight for scraps, he redesigned the business. When Félix Gallardo was arrested in 1989, legend says he divided Mexico's trafficking corridors among his lieutenants. Tijuana went to the Arellano Félix brothers. Juarez went to Amado Carrillo Fuentes, and Sinaloa went to Joaquín Guzmán. It wasn't the biggest territory, but it was the most flexible, and flexibility, Joaquín understood, was everything. Instead of demanding cash from Colombian suppliers, he proposed something radical. He would move their product through Mexico, but instead of money, he wanted payment in cocaine. That single shift transformed him from transporter to competitor. He no longer just moved drugs, he owned them. Ownership meant margin. While rivals fought over routes, Guzmán invested in infrastructure. He pioneered underground tunnels, streamlined transportation, and built redundancy into every operation. If one shipment failed, 10 more followed. By the early 1990s, Colombian cartels were lining up to work with him, not because he was feared, but because he was fast. They called him El Rápido, the fast one. Money poured in, mansions, private planes, exotic animals, but none of that was the point. Scale was the point. While others saw themselves as kings, Guzmán saw himself as a CEO, and every empire needs systems. That system was tested in 1993 when authorities finally caught him after a botched assassination attempt that killed a Catholic archbishop. Sentenced to 20 years in prison, Guzmán entered Puente Grande not as a defeated criminal, but as an executive working remotely. He bribed guards, installed his own chef, smuggled phones, and ran meetings from behind bars. For 8 years, he refined his most dangerous skill yet: control from confinement. Everything changed in January 2001 when Mexico's Supreme Court made extradition to the United States easier. For Guzmán, extradition wasn't justice, it was a death sentence. So on January 19, 2001, he climbed into a laundry cart, held his breath, and rolled past 8 security checkpoints into freedom. The world laughed, the government panicked, El Chapo vanished into the mountains. But that escape wasn't the climax, it was the signal. Because what came next wasn't survival, it was domination. And in the next part of this story, you'll see how El Chapo transformed the drug trade into a multinational corporation, why that transformation made him richer and faster than anyone before him, and how it also planted the seeds of his eventual downfall. When Joaquín Guzmán disappeared into the mountains after his 2001 escape, most people assumed he would spend the rest of his life hiding. That was a misunderstanding of who he was. El Chapo didn't escape prison to survive. He escaped to rebuild. And when he resurfaced, he didn't come back as a fugitive scrambling for safety. He came back as the architect of something far bigger than a cartel. He came back to finish turning his operation into a corporation. The mountains of Sinaloa were more than a hiding place. They were a headquarters. Remote, difficult to access, and protected by layers of loyal communities, they allowed Guzmán to operate beyond the reach of conventional law enforcement. From there, he reconnected with his most trusted partner, Ismael El Mayo Zambada. If Guzmán was the visionary CEO, Zambada was the operator, the man who ensured the machine ran smoothly day after day. Together, they rebuilt the Sinaloa Cartel with a level of discipline and organization that had never existed in the drug world before. What set Guzmán apart wasn't brutality alone. Plenty of traffickers were violent. What made him different was consistency. He delivered product on time. He paid partners reliably. He solved problems instead of creating them. In an industry built on mistrust, that reputation was priceless. Slowly, suppliers and distributors gravitated toward him, not because they feared him, but because doing business with him worked. One of Guzmán's most important insights was understanding demand. Unlike rivals who focused on a single drug, he treated narcotics like a diversified product line. Marijuana, heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine, and later fentanyl all moved through his network. Pablo Escobar had built an empire on cocaine alone. Guzmán looked at that model and saw vulnerability. If demand for one product dipped or enforcement tightened, the entire operation suffered. Sinaloa would not make that mistake. By offering everything, Guzmán made himself indispensable. He also understood margins. Plant-based drugs like marijuana and opium depended on harvest cycles, weather, and farmers. Synthetic drugs didn't. Methamphetamine could be produced year-round, anywhere, using easily sourced chemicals. It was cheaper to make, easier to transport, and far more profitable. A kilo that cost a few $100s to produce could sell for tens of thousands once broken down and distributed in the United States. Guzmán wasn't just following the market, he was reshaping it. As law enforcement pressure increased on drug labs in the United States and Canada, Guzmán moved production into Mexico, exploiting regulatory blind spots. Labs were disguised as beauty product manufacturers. Pill presses were registered as cosmetic equipment. Entire industrial zones became wolves in sheep's clothing. Synthetic drugs gave Sinaloa total control over production, pricing, and supply. There were no farmers to negotiate with, no seasons to wait out. The cartel became vertically integrated. But products were only half the equation. Distribution was where Guzmán truly separated himself from everyone else. He understood that the riskiest moment for any shipment was crossing the border. Once drugs made it into the United States, their value multiplied exponentially. The solution wasn't avoiding risk entirely, it was spreading it. Instead of relying on one method, he used all of them. Tractor-trailers, private vehicles, trains, boats, ultralight aircraft, tunnels, and even catapults. Some shipments were seized, many weren't. That was acceptable. Losses were built into the system. It was the cost of doing business. Like a logistics giant, Sinaloa planned for failure and scaled for success. The tunnels became his signature. They were feats of engineering that rivaled legitimate infrastructure projects. Lit, ventilated, and sometimes equipped with rail systems and elevators, they allowed massive shipments to move beneath the border undetected. Engineers calculated deviations down to fractions of an inch, accounting even for the curvature of the earth. A single tunnel could move more product in a day than dozens of vehicles could move in a month. Speed earned him a new nickname, El Rápido, the fast one. Inside the United States, Guzmán applied the same logic. He didn't rely on a single distribution hub. He built a network. Cities like Chicago became central nodes, chosen not by chance, but by geography. Rail lines, highways, population density, and existing criminal infrastructure made it the perfect hub to redistribute drugs across the country. Over time, an estimated 90% of the narcotics in some regions could be traced back to Sinaloa. To manage this scale, Guzmán built an organization that mirrored a multinational corporation. Finance, logistics, enforcement, intelligence, and political outreach were all separated into compartments. Most people inside the system didn't know how the entire machine worked. They didn't need to. Compartmentalization protected the whole. If one part was compromised, the others survived. Money posed its own challenge. Drugs were easy to move compared to cash. Millions of dollars in small bills were heavy, bulky, and suspicious. Guzmán's solution was diversification again. Smurfing operations deposited small amounts across thousands of accounts. Trade-based money laundering converted cash into goods that could be exported and resold. Real estate, ranches, shopping centers, and even daycare facilities became financial washing machines. Legitimate banks were used when possible. In one of the great ironies of the drug war, international institutions like HSBC were later found to have laundered hundreds of millions of cartel dollars with minimal consequences. As the machine grew, so did violence. Expansion meant conflict. When Guzmán moved into territories controlled by rival cartels, negotiations were brief. In the narco world, hostile takeovers were literal. Leaders were eliminated. Entire organizations were wiped out to prevent retaliation. Cities like Ciudad Juárez became war zones. Tens of thousands died. Civilians, police, journalists, and rivals were all caught in the crossfire. Yet, as bloodshed escalated, Guzmán's profits soared. He thrived in chaos. While rivals weakened each other, Sinaloa absorbed routes, contacts, and markets. At the same time, Guzmán cultivated an image. He wasn't just feared, he was admired. Narco ballads were written about him. His name appeared on Forbes' list of billionaires. In poor communities abandoned by the state, he He funded roads, churches, and schools. To many, he wasn't a criminal, he was a provider. That myth became armor. It bought silence, it bought loyalty, and it bought time. But myths have a cost. As Guzmán's legend grew, so did his ego. He enjoyed being seen as untouchable. He enjoyed the attention, and slowly that confidence turned into carelessness. Technology became his blind spot. Encrypted phones, surveillance software, digital networks that allowed him to micromanage operations across continents. What Guzmán saw as control, law enforcement saw as access. Informants were turned, servers were compromised, messages were intercepted. Piece by piece, the invisible web around him tightened. By the early 2010s, the machine was still running, but cracks were forming. Trusted allies defected, shipments were seized more frequently, violence attracted scrutiny instead of fear. Guzmán adjusted, but not fast enough. He believed his systems were flawless. He believed his reputation protected him. That belief would cost him, because the same discipline that built his empire made him predictable. Patterns emerged, habits formed, and for the first time since his rise, the world's most powerful drug trafficker was being studied not as a myth, but as a man. And in the next part of this story, you'll see how that confidence unraveled, how surveillance replaced gunfights, how a global manhunt closed in, and how the system El Chapo built finally began to turn against him. By the time Joaquín Guzmán realized the world around him had changed, it was already too late to go back. The skills that once made him untouchable were now the very things exposing him. His obsession with control, his need to oversee every detail, every shipment, every conversation, had pushed him deeper into technology. And technology, unlike fear or money, did not respect reputation. For years, Guzmán had relied on face-to-face meetings, handwritten notes, and trusted intermediaries. But as his empire expanded across continents, that became impossible. The cartel was operating on 5 continents, moving product into the United States, Canada, Europe, Asia, and Australia. Deals were happening around the clock. Problems demanded immediate solutions. Speed mattered more than secrecy. And so Guzmán embraced encrypted phones, private servers, and digital surveillance tools, believing they made him invisible. What he didn't understand was that digital systems don't just transmit information, they leave trails. One of the most consequential decisions Guzmán ever made was bringing a Colombian IT specialist named Christian Rodriguez into his inner circle. Rodriguez was tasked with solving a practical problem: poor communication in the mountains. He installed internet relays, set up encrypted calling systems, and created a closed digital network that allowed Guzmán to communicate instantly with lieutenants across the world. To Guzmán, it felt like power. To law enforcement, it would become a gold mine. The system went even further. Guzmán ordered spyware installed on the phones of his own people. Girlfriends, aides, accountants, and commanders were unknowingly monitored. Their calls, messages, GPS locations, and even microphone audio could be accessed remotely. Guzmán believed this made betrayal impossible. In reality, it meant that once one person flipped, everything flipped with them. Rodriguez eventually did flip. When U.S. authorities arrested him during a sting operation, they didn't just gain an informant, they gained a map of Guzmán's digital nervous system. Servers were quietly relocated, encryption keys were copied, entire networks were mirrored without the cartel's knowledge. For the first time, American agents weren't chasing rumors, they were reading messages in real time. What they saw shocked even veteran investigators. Despite the violence, despite the chaos, Guzmán was struggling. Shipments were being seized at higher rates. Trusted distributors were secretly cooperating with authorities. Cash flow was tightening. Payments were delayed. For a man whose reputation depended on reliability, that was dangerous. To compensate, Guzmán pushed harder. He expanded into fentanyl, a drug so potent that a single kilo could produce 1 million lethal doses. It was cheaper, easier to move, and devastatingly profitable. But fentanyl came with consequences. Overdose deaths in the United States skyrocketed. Political pressure intensified. Interagency cooperation between Mexican and American forces reached levels never seen before. Guzmán was no longer just a drug trafficker, he was a symbol, and symbols attract attention. In 2012, that attention nearly ended everything. Using intercepted communications from one of Guzmán's girlfriends, authorities pinpointed him to a luxury residence in Los Cabos. It should have been a clean operation. Instead, delays, miscommunication, and mistakes gave Guzmán just enough warning. He fled through an unsecured exit moments before police entered the property. By the time agents realized what had happened, he was already gone. For Guzmán, it was confirmation of his belief that he was still smarter than everyone else. For law enforcement, he was a wake-up call. They adjusted tactics: fewer raids, more patience, less force, more listening. They stopped chasing Guzmán directly and started dismantling the people around him. One by one, his lieutenants were arrested. Phone by phone, the network was mapped. Code names were decoded. Patterns emerged. Certain BlackBerry devices lit up constantly. Those belonged to the real decision-makers. Others went silent after arrests. Those were expendable. Meanwhile, Guzmán grew increasingly paranoid. He rotated safe houses frequently, moving between nondescript homes in Culiacán. Each was equipped with hidden tunnels connecting to the city's drainage system. He trusted infrastructure more than people. If the army came, the tunnels would save him. They always had. But tunnels couldn't protect him from betrayal. In February 2014, one of Guzmán's trusted secretaries was arrested. At first, he lied. Then, an FBI agent casually mentioned a detail only someone inside the network would know: a food delivery, a word from a text message intercepted earlier that day. In that moment, the secretary realized the truth. They were listening to everything. Within hours, Marines surrounded one of Guzmán's safe houses. When they breached the door, Guzmán was already moving. Barefoot and naked, he vanished through a tunnel beneath the bathtub as soldiers flooded the room. Grenades were tossed down the shaft, but Guzmán kept running. He emerged miles away, escaped again, and disappeared into the city before dawn. For the world, it looked like another miracle, another legend reinforced, another middle finger to the state. But for Guzmán, something had changed. He was no longer relaxed, no longer patient. He began making mistakes. He trusted the wrong people. He stayed too long in familiar places. And, worst of all, he couldn't resist comfort. The mountains were safe, but they were isolating. He wanted luxury again, normalcy, family. That desire led him to Mazatlan. In February 2014, after tracking communications and movements for weeks, authorities stormed the Hotel Miramar. This time, there was no tunnel, no escape route. Guzmán was cornered in a hotel room with his wife and children. For a moment, he considered fighting. Then his wife begged the soldiers not to harm their daughters. Guzmán surrendered. For the second time, the world watched as El Chapo was paraded before cameras. Officials declared victory. They promised it was over. He was placed in Mexico's most secure prison, El Plátano, a facility designed specifically to prevent another escape. But Guzmán had heard that before. Behind bars, he did what he always did. He adapted. He bribed. He communicated through lawyers, guards, and visitors. And quietly, methodically, his sons and lieutenants began planning. Because for El Chapo Guzmán, prison was never the end of the story. It was just another obstacle. And in the next part, you'll see how he pulled off the most audacious prison escape in modern history, why it shocked the world, and how that moment marked the beginning of the end. By the time Joaquín Guzmán settled into his cell at Altiplano, Mexican officials publicly insisted that escape was impossible. This was not Puente Grande. This prison had been engineered around one man. Cameras tracked every movement. Guards rotated constantly. His cell was inspected daily. Even the shower was visible to surveillance. On paper, it was flawless. But prisons, like systems, fail when they underestimate incentives. From inside his concrete box, Guzmán continued to run his empire. Messages passed through lawyers. Orders moved through his wife and children. His sons, already deeply embedded in the cartel's operations, took on greater responsibility. And slowly, quietly, they began preparing for something extraordinary. Not a bribe, not a disguise, something far more ambitious. About a mile from the prison, a small property was purchased under a false name. It looked ordinary, a warehouse, nothing unusual, But beneath it, work began. Engineers, many of them unaware of the full purpose, were paid to dig. GPS data smuggled out of the prison pinpointed Guzmán's exact location down to the meter. The tunnel wasn't dug toward the prison, it was dug toward a single point inside it, straight toward the shower. The tunnel was a masterpiece, lit, ventilated, reinforced. A rail system ran its length. A modified motorcycle sat on the tracks, ready to move at high speed. Oxygen tanks were placed at intervals. The cost ran into the millions, but cost was irrelevant. This wasn't just an escape, it was a statement. On the night of July 11, 2015, Guzmán followed his routine. Cameras recorded him pacing his cell. He removed his shoes. He stepped into the shower. For a few seconds, his body blocked the camera's view. Then, he was gone. In less than 4 seconds, the most guarded prisoner in Mexico disappeared. He dropped into the tunnel, climbed down a ladder, mounted the motorcycle, and rode a mile beneath the prison walls. By the time guards realized what had happened, Guzmán was already being driven away, then flown back to Sinaloa. The country erupted. The president faced global embarrassment. International headlines mocked Mexican security. And El Chapo became something few criminals ever achieve, a living legend. For Guzmán, the escape was intoxicating. It reinforced everything he believed about himself, that he was smarter, that systems were flawed, that no cage could hold him. But that confidence would become his undoing, because the world had changed again. This time, the response was different. Cooperation between American and Mexican agencies intensified, surveillance expanded, resources multiplied. Guzmán was no longer being hunted quietly, he was being hunted relentlessly. And unlike before, there would be no tolerance for failure. Meanwhile, Guzmán made a fatal mistake. Instead of disappearing, he reinserted himself into operations almost immediately. He resumed using the same communication methods, the same devices, the same networks that had already betrayed him once. He believed the problem had been people, not systems. He was wrong. Intercepted messages soon revealed his movements. Safe houses were identified, patterns re-emerged. One message in particular revealed plans to meet in Los Mochis, a city in northern Sinaloa. Mexican Marines moved fast. This time there would be no delays. Before dawn on January 8, 2016, they stormed the house. Gunfire erupted instantly. Guzmán and his security chief fled through a tunnel, emerging into the street. They hijacked a car. It broke down. They hijacked another. For a brief moment, it looked like history might repeat itself. Then they hit a checkpoint. There were no tunnels, no bribes, no escape routes left. Guzmán was identified, detained, and placed in custody. The chase was over. This time, the authorities didn't celebrate prematurely. They moved him constantly between facilities. Guards were vetted, communication was restricted, bribes were refused, and within days, extradition proceedings began. Guzmán fought it desperately. He knew what extradition meant. In Mexico, money and influence still worked. In the United States, they didn't. Once he crossed that border in chains, his power would evaporate. In January 2017, Joaquín Guzmán was flown to New York. As the plane landed, witnesses saw him peering out the window with tears in his eyes. For the first time in decades, he understood something fundamental. This was not another setback. This was the end of the road. In Brooklyn, the trial became a spectacle. Snipers on rooftops, bomb-sniffing dogs, witnesses flown in from around the world. Former allies testified. Text messages were read aloud. Ledgers were displayed. The mythology collapsed under evidence. Guzmán watched as people he once controlled described murders, shipments, bribes, and orders in meticulous detail. He smiled sometimes. He waved at the actor who portrayed him on television. He enjoyed the attention. Even now, the legend mattered. But the verdict was inevitable. Guilty on all counts. Life in prison plus 30 years. When the sentence was read, there was no tunnel to run through, no wall to climb, no system left to exploit. Only a cage designed to never open. And in the final part of this story, you'll see what remains when the myth is stripped away, where El Chapo is now, what his empire looks like without him, and whether removing the most powerful drug trafficker in history actually changed anything at all. When Joaquín Guzmán Loera arrived at ADX Florence, the mythology ended. There were no cameras to play to here, no crowds, no bribable guards, no whispers of escape plans floating through corridors. This prison was not designed to rehabilitate or even punish in the traditional sense. It was designed to erase people. ADX Florence sits in the high desert of Colorado, surrounded by empty land and watchtowers. Prisoners spend 23 hours a day alone in concrete cells the size of a parking space. The bed is concrete. The desk is concrete. The walls are poured so thick that sound doesn't travel. The windows are narrow slits angled toward the sky so inmates can't tell where they are or what direction they're facing. Meals are pushed through slots. Human contact is reduced to echoes. For a man who built his power on communication, movement, and presence, it was psychological annihilation. Guzmán was placed in Range 13, an even more restrictive wing reserved for inmates considered uniquely dangerous. Phone calls were limited, visits were rare, letters were screened, legal documents were restricted after prison officials concluded he might use them to coordinate another escape. The man who once controlled logistics across 5 continents now needed permission to leave his cell for a shower. His lawyers argued that the conditions amounted to torture. Guzmán complained of mental suffering, sensory deprivation, and despair. He claimed guards sabotaged his sleep. He begged to be transferred back to Mexico. Every appeal failed. For the first time in his life, Joaquín Guzmán had no leverage. Outside the prison walls, the world moved on quickly. The Sinaloa Cartel did not collapse, it adapted. His sons stepped into leadership roles. Old alliances shifted. New routes opened. Shipments continued. In some areas, violence even increased as rival factions fought to fill perceived gaps in power. Within days of his conviction, one of the largest fentanyl seizures in U.S. history occurred at the border. The uncomfortable truth became impossible to ignore. El Chapo was never the system. He was a product of it. For decades, governments had focused almost exclusively on supply, capture the kingpin, seize the shipments, destroy the routes. And yet demand never disappeared. Addiction kept growing. Synthetic drugs made production easier, cheaper, deadlier. One man removed from the board changed nothing fundamental. In the United States, overdose deaths continued to rise year after year. Communities were hollowed out, families buried children, and the drugs kept coming, not because of El Chapo, but because the market never stopped asking for them. Guzmán understood this better than anyone. He didn't create addiction, he exploited it. He read demand signals like a CEO reads quarterly reports. When heroin demand rose, he pivoted. When meth offered better margins, he scaled. When fentanyl appeared, he industrialized death with brutal efficiency. He didn't moralize, he optimized. And that is why his removal felt emotionally satisfying but strategically hollow. Outside the prison walls, the world moved on quickly. The U.S. government ordered him to forfeit more than $12 billion. Most of it was never recovered. Shell companies, cash economies, layered laundering systems had already absorbed it. Meanwhile, legitimate institutions that facilitated the flow, banks, pharmaceutical companies, distributors, paid fines that barely dented their balance sheets. No executives went to prison. The contrast was stark. Guzmán died socially in a concrete box, while others whose actions also fueled addiction testified in suits and returned home to mansions. The system punished visible evil more harshly than profitable negligence. And yet, Guzmán was no misunderstood rebel. The violence he unleashed was real. Thousands died, entire regions were destabilized. Fear was a business tool he wielded deliberately. His charisma, generosity, and folklore never erased the bodies left behind. He was not a hero. He was not a victim. He was an extreme example of what happens when markets operate without morality and power goes unchecked. In his cell, days blur together. There are no tunnels to plan, no calls to monitor, no shipments to approve. The legend that once filled songs and headlines now exists mostly online, recycled in documentaries, podcasts, and clothing brands that trade on his image. Ironically, even stripped of freedom, El Chapo remains a brand. But brands fade when they stop delivering relevance. The cartel continues without him. The drug trade evolves beyond him. New figures rise, quieter, more technical, less theatrical. The age of flamboyant kingpins is giving way to something colder, more distributed, more anonymous. In that sense, Guzmán represents both the peak and the end of an era, a man who mastered a brutal system and was ultimately consumed by its scale. So the final question isn't whether El Chapo was evil or brilliant or both. The real question is whether removing him made the world safer. And if the answer is no, then maybe the most unsettling legacy of Joaquín Guzmán Loera is not what he did, but the systems that allowed him to thrive.